And I was talking to Jenny earlier, and I told her I'll be glad whenever the portions of 1 Peter become a little bit easier to understand and explain. This section right here has been frying my brain. But the Lord's been helping. 1 Peter 4. It starts with, verse 1 starts with the word therefore. And it helped me, it might help you to consider this, that this therefore is reflecting back to verse 18 of chapter 3. And verses 19 and through 22 of chapter 3 is like a parenthesis. That was helpful to me to think of that. It would read like this: For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh. Do you see it? It's a little bit easier. So 19 through 22, he puts almost in brackets, and he goes off talking about Noah and the flood and the preaching to those spirits now in prison and so on. And so our portion today, just view it as an extension of that verse 18 in chapter 3. It's a little bit easier to understand. So verse 1 of chapter 4, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Well, I've had a question mark in my mind for that verse for quite some time. So as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desires of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lusts, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. And in all this, they're surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. But they will give an account to him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. For the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead. Question mark. That though they're judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the Spirit according to the will of God. Well, and so we embark on these verses, 1 through 6. First thing, Christ the example. That's pretty plain. Since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same purpose. So Christ has suffered in the flesh. What does that mean? Well, it means in his physical body while he was here on the earth, he suffered in the flesh, even to the point of his atoning death for sin. And this last portion of verse 1, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, they tell me, my grammar experts tell me that this is written so that the last part of that verse could either apply to the first part of the verse in regard to Jesus, or it could apply to the believer. So he has suffered in the flesh, Christ has, to the point of dying, atoning for sin. And he has ceased from dealing with sin once and for all. says, he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Well, of course it can't mean Jesus quit sinning. We all know that. That would be contrary to the whole Bible. In fact, Peter said, the just for the unjust. Christ was sinless. So it can't mean that. But if it refers to Jesus, the last part of the verse, if that refers to Jesus, it means he's ceased from dealing with sin. He's died, the atonement. He's ceased from dealing with sin once and for all. He's ceased from resisting it. Jesus resisted sin. That's how he was sinless when he arrived at the cross. The Bible tells us he was tempted in every way like we are, yet without sin. So Jesus, in regard to sin, was at least tempted, but he ceased from that. He is sinless. He's ceased from dealing with it. He's ceased from resisting sin, and he has ceased for atoning for it. On the cross, what were his final words? It is finished. He's done with all of it. Hebrews 9 tells us, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin. He's done with it. That's in the past. That was dealt with. So I think if the last part of verse 1 applies to Christ, having suffered in the flesh, he's ceased from sin on that level. He's done with it. All of it. You know, everything he did perfectly. Everything was complete. There was nothing left undone. There was no thread left untied. Nothing forgotten. Nothing overlooked. It was all done. In regard to the atonement and sin, it was all done. He took care of that for me, for you, believer. He took care of all of that. Nothing left. Nevertheless, Peter tells us here, arm yourselves also with the same purpose. The same purpose. Suffering in the flesh, ceasing from sin. The same purpose. Well, it can't be the exact same purpose as Christ, because Christ died for the purpose of our redemption, our atonement. So it can't be on that level that the admonition comes to you and me. We're trying to make application here, because Peter did. Arm yourselves with the same purpose. That's application. But there's something nonetheless for us to follow in his example here. So what is it? What are we to arm ourselves with? What is the purpose that ought to be ours as it was his? Well, I believe that it means equip yourselves with the same resolve that Christ had. That is, a willingness to suffer for doing the will of God, for doing right, for well-doing. Jesus suffered for all of that. And a common recurring theme in this letter is that of suffering unjustly. We've seen it up to this point in Peter's writings. So equip yourselves with the same resolve that Jesus had. Do the will of God no matter what. If it costs and you suffer for it, do it still. I think that's what he's saying right here. Arm yourselves with that purpose. Look at the life of the Lord Jesus here and what he suffered for doing right. All he did was right, and he went about doing good, healing people and so on. What did he suffer in regard to that? He suffered a lot of slander. He suffered rejection. It says he came to his own, but his own did not receive him. He suffered hatred. He said, they hated me without a cause. And he applied that Old Testament to him. He suffered insults. You realize they said that he casts out demons by the power, the prince of demons? What an insult. The Lord of glory. They said, you're altogether born of fornication. Could you insult someone any worse than that? His heritage, his parentage. Speaking, of course, of Joseph and Mary and the virgin birth. They insulted him. They said he has a demon. Even his family said he's lost his mind. They went out to bring him back somehow. All the crowds were following Christ, and all of this excitement around him and everything, it was out of control. He's lost his mind. They said, what an insult. So he suffered insults. He was misunderstood. Is there anyone more misunderstood than Christ in all of the world? Even his disciples misunderstood all the way to the very end. His own family. Think of the great ordeal of inner anguish that he suffered in the garden, wrestling there 3 times, praying, if there's any other way, let this pass from me. Inner anguish. But yet not my will, but yours be done. He suffered. There was a willingness for all that suffering, all the way up to the cross. We tend to focus on the cross of Christ as his suffering for us, and well, we should, but there was plenty of it in all of his life before he ever got there. And so Peter, I think, is telling his readers in regard to this idea of suffering, arm yourselves with the same resolve that Christ had. He did the will of God. I always do the will of my Father, regardless of what it cost him. And ceased from sin. We have that phrase there. He who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. So I think that means the believer who suffered in this world for doing right, and he goes on obeying God no matter the cost, displays that he has made a clean break with sin. He's done with that. It's not referring to absolute sinless perfection. Obviously, it's not referring to that. But it's referring to the habitual practice of sin, the domination of sin. He's ceased from that aspect of sin. He's done with it. And we're exhorted in the Bible in really strong terms that way. Paul says in Romans 6, for instance, in verse 1, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin, that grace may abound? He says, by no means. It's absurd to think of it. How can we who died to sin still live in it? Habitually. It's not talking about sinless perfection. And John, in his first letter, chapter 3 and verse 6, he says, no one who abides in him sins. Well, if you read that, there are those that say, well, that means sinless perfection from here on. I knew someone that was an open-air preacher who stated something along the lines of, I haven't sinned in 20 years. They hold these verses literally. Because the Bible, it is strong language. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. He takes it even a step further and says, if this is your life, you don't know him. You're demonstrating the fact you've not even seen him or know him. That's strong language, nonetheless. So, John, what do you mean by all of this? Well, John, in his letter, chapter 3, verse 8, he says, the one who practices sin is of the devil. Oh, it's the practice of sin. That's sheds some light on it. So it's habitually dominated by sin. It's the automatic response in this given situation is to sin continually. You see, that's the habit. Now, there are those that say it takes 21 days to establish a habit. I mean, you can find that on the internet. They speculate. You want to build a good habit? Set aside 21 days, do it every day, faithfully within 21 days, and then before long it becomes automatic. It becomes a natural response. Predictably, establish a habit. This is talking about habitual sin. And the word practice right there is the same word that we use for a doctor practices medicine. A lawyer practices law. An athlete practices his sport. You do it over and over again. In athletics, there's such a thing as muscle memory. You do the same move continually all the time, and it becomes second nature. That pitcher throws that ball the same way all the time. Before long, he doesn't have to think about it. He just does it, and it happens. It's reactive. Well, it's the same way. When we practice sin on that level, it becomes second nature. It's what we do. Given this situation, that's a sinful response. It's habitual. It's continual. Do you see it? It's the practice of sin. And so the one who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. That's what he's talking about, the habitual domination of sin. John goes on to say, no one who is born of God practices sin. Why, John? Because God's seed abides in him, and he cannot sin. He's born of God. The nature is changed inwardly, you see. He's changed. He can't do that. He can't continue to do that. You remember the woman caught in adultery? Cast at Jesus' feet, her accusers there, as the story goes. Jesus says, whoever's without sin, cast the first stone, and one by one they disappeared, and Jesus stood up, looked around, and they were all gone. And the words of Jesus to that woman, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. So what was he telling her right there? Go and in sinless perfection live out the rest of your life? That's not what he was telling her. He was saying, in regard to this sin that you've been caught in, go and don't do that anymore. Go and sin no more. Habitual sin. You remember that man that was beside the pool of Bethesda, waiting for the angel to trouble the waters so he could step in and be healed, and Jesus healed him? And the account right there, in the end, the final words to Jesus were, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. That's not go and be sinless for the rest of your life. That's whatever it was, and that was between Jesus and that man. That man knew what Jesus was talking about. Whatever it had you in its grip, that to the extent that you were paying for that, go and don't do that anymore so nothing worse happens to you. Habitual sin. So it's a willingness, I think, here in this verse to suffer if necessary for doing right in the eyes of God, obeying God to the extent that it has become habitual regardless of the cost of it, even if it is suffering. Obeying God has become the most important thing. Arm yourselves with that purpose. Then he says, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. The rest of the time in the flesh. Well, that seems kind of explanatory right there, that it means you've got time left in this world. certain amount of it. It's the amount of time you have left in this life. It's the here and now. It's the present. That's the rest of the time in the flesh. You've heard that saying, perhaps, today is the first day of the rest of your life. Well, that's real. It's true, isn't it? From here on out, that's the rest of the time in the flesh. Today is the first day of that. So the past, it's gone, never to be retrieved. You can't do anything about that. You can't dwell on that. You can't be dominated by the past. We can learn from it, but we can't be ruled by it, the past. Someone gave that illustration. The rearview mirror is really small, but the windshield is big. And there's some reality in that. That's a good illustration. I like that. You look up at the rearview mirror and it shows you what you went past, and it's pretty small. But what's ahead is big. The future, it's not here yet, of course, but the future can be affected by the present, right now. And the emphasis of the Bible is not on the past, it's on the present and what's coming for us, for the believer. Today's choices affect the future. And choices have consequences, don't they? So the time that is already past and the rest of the time in the flesh. Well, the rest of the time in the flesh is limited. We know that. I was told by a financial planner one time when I was talking about my retirement and trying to get some insight on my retirement that I had coming from my work in the construction trades. And of course the question is, how much do I need for my retirement? And he said, tell me how long you're going to live and I'll tell you how much to save. You know, we can't do that. And it's probably cliche among those financial planners. They probably all snicker when they say that. Just tell me it's easy. Tell me how long you're going to live. Well, nobody knows that. The rest of the time for you don't have any idea how long that's going to be. It's limited. Jesus said, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble. It's limited. Well, it's very valuable, the time you have left, because it is limited. Jesus also said, we must work the works of him who sent me as long as it's day, because night's coming when no one can work. So there are opportunities afforded you today that are limited. Life is nearing its end for all of us. The end is getting closer. We know that. For some of us, it's closer than others, obviously. But I must employ the time that I have in doing the will of God. The rest of the time in the flesh. The rest of the time in the flesh is your responsibility to live for the will of God. So it is limited, it's very valuable, and it's your responsibility. He says to live no longer for human desires, but rather for the will of God. So our priorities, it's our responsibility, the days that we have left, or years. Our priorities, to live for the will of God. Jesus said no one can serve two masters. It's an either-or proposition. It's not a both-and proposition. Either-or. You can only have one master. You can't divide that way. So we have to live for the will of God. He says, no longer for human desires, but for the will of God, our priorities. So Peter goes on to explain the idea of ceased from sin here in more detail. He says it's a clean break from sin with a life that is lived for God. It takes a higher level of commitment and resolve to obey God no matter what the cost, even if it involves suffering. So the questions that we have to ask ourselves when we read this verse right here, living the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for desires of man, but for the will of God, we have to ask ourselves, what are our priorities? Where do our loyalties lie? What do we choose over God? I mean, those are sharp, searching questions. More sharp than most questions I put to this congregation. Do we really put His kingdom first and His glory the highest? It says, live for the will of God. Do we deny ourselves and purpose to follow Christ no matter what? That's what Peter's talking about here. You see, this letter was written to those that were scattered all over, and they were suffering for doing good. The apostles, Paul, for instance, said to the Philippian church in chapter 3 and verse 13, in regard to his own condition, he said, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind, that's the past, and reaching forward to what lies ahead, that's through the windshield, not the rearview mirror. The rest of the time in the flesh, it's ahead, it's not behind. I press on toward the goal of the prize of the upward calling of God in Christ Jesus. That is, I live for the will of God. Then he goes on to say, let us therefore, as many as are perfect, that is, true Christians, he's talking about, have this attitude. So it's similar to what Peter said, arm yourself with the same purpose. For me to live as Christ, he said, to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. There's living for the will of God. So the rest of the time in the flesh. But then he speaks in verse 3, the time that's already passed. So time is a subject here again. And the time that's already passed, he says, is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles. He says, it's enough. What was behind you, the life you lived behind you, that was enough of that. You don't need that anymore. So he's saying, give no more time to the practice of sin. What you did in the past, make a clean break from it. It's time to move on from that. You know, some people struggle with the same sins all perpetually for years. And every time you see them, they're morose and sad and miserable and defeated. And some are perpetually struggling with assurance. They're always assurance of their salvation. And it's ongoing forever and ever, it seems like, because they still harbor the sins of the past. They haven't heard the verse that Peter's saying right here. The time already past was sufficient for all of that. Be done with it. Now, look at the time ahead, the time that you have left in this life. Live it for the glory of God, not the desires of man. You see that clean break from sin and the new priority? Put that behind you. I honestly think that's why some people are always struggling with this idea of assurance, because they can't break with the sins of the past. They won't do what is necessary to have free fellowship with God and with God's people, the church. They won't do that. I had a phone call with a man that was from another country. I've talked to him at least 3 times now. He's called me. And the conversation always centers around how miserable he is. I think God has abandoned me. I think God is done with me. I think that God doesn't want anything more to do with me. I think I've sinned away the presence of God. And 3 times the conversation has gone like that. The very first time he called me, we had a conversation, and I gave him some counsel. I told him what to do. The next time he called, it was the same thing, the same problem, the same lack of assurance. And I asked, did you do what I recommended? And, well, no. And so I told him the same thing. Again, this is what you need to do. The third time that he called, did you do what I recommended for you to do? No, he hadn't. And that time I was much more short with him than the other times, because honestly, he's wasting my time. Because he wouldn't do what I told him to do. And if he would have followed those things that I told him to do, he wouldn't be in the situation that he's in right now, biblically. So there is a sense here where we read these words, the time has already passed, it's sufficient. You need to be done with that. You need to grow up and move on. You need to put that behind you. So they don't want to live for the revealed will of God, and it's problematic. There's a battle of the wills going on here in this verse. You see it? It's the desire of the Gentiles, the lusts of men. And that doesn't always have to have some kind of a sexual connotation to it. It simply means strong, selfish desires that are against the revealed will of God. It does, in this verse, the sins that he listed there, indicate the pursuit of pleasure. And he calls them Gentiles, but in Peter's day that would be Gentile, idolaters, pagans. But in our day it would be referring to people, not people that are not Jews, but people that are not Christians, the way the world lives. The desire of the Gentiles, the way the world lives. And he says it's time wasted carrying out the desire of the Gentiles. It's past. Be done with it. He says, having pursued a course. That's interesting language right there. That time was past. There was a course that was pursued. In your previous life, in my previous life, there was a course pursued. A habitual following of self, my own desires. And I heartily raise my hand and say that was me. I was a selfish person. Pursued a course. So that makes me ask the question, what course are we pursuing? What road are we on? That's what a course is. It's a road. What is the course on which your life is set? What are you pursuing? It's the world of the godless that is known for these kinds of things listed here in this verse. And it's quite a list, isn't it? It's similar to the list that we find in Galatians 5, where it's described as the works of the flesh. And similar to the list that we find in 1 Corinthians 6, where there again is described deeds of the flesh. And both of those sections finish with those that do those things will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's that habitual lifestyle. And so Peter is saying here in this verse, that's what the Gentiles, the worldlings, pursue. They pursue that. Be done with it. Don't pursue the same course as them. It's a shameless pursuit of pleasure. It's a zeal for wickedness. Doesn't it amaze you how zealous the world can be in a pursuit of wickedness? Peter, in this same letter in chapter 1, he said, as obedient children, don't be conformed to the former lusts, which were yours in ignorance. That's the time past, already past. Well, I'm thankful for the powerful change that the new birth has, because from then on, things are different. Paul said to the Romans in chapter 6 and verse 21, therefore, what benefit were you then deriving from the things of which you're now ashamed? We look back on the past and we shake our heads and hang them in shame. That's what I once was. And it was shameful. Well, he speaks about participation here. In verse 4, he says, in all this, they're surprised that you do not run with them in the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. You don't run with them. We could ask ourselves, in what ways do we run with them? Well, surely it's bad associations coupled, with peer pressure. Bad associations and peer pressure cause us to go with the crowd. Surely it could be that, swept along with the crowd. And we should always, as parents, teach our children to stand alone, not be afraid to stand alone against the crowd. Moses in the law in Exodus 23 and verse 1, he says, don't join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. And you shall not fall in with the many to do evil. That's joining in with the crowd, participating. And he also says siding with the many so as to pervert justice. Well, here's a reckless, immoral lifestyle. That's what excesses of dissipation are. Wastefulness of money, energy, life, all of that. Don't side in with them. Don't join with them. Don't be a participant with them. Of the prodigal son, it said there, he squandered his property in reckless living. He had spent everything, and his brother pointed out that he had devoured his father's property with prostitutes. That's excesses of dissipation. And we're not to join in with that. The world says, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Paul tells the Corinthian church not to be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. Become sober-minded as you ought, he says, and stop sinning, for some have no knowledge of God. And I speak this to your shame, he told the Corinthian church. So here's this idea of run with them. That's the words right there of the text. Do not run with them. Well, it could be that we don't actually do the things that are listed right here, but it could be in some way we voice our approval. We give our consent of it. In Romans 1:32, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those that practice them. There's some way that we can participate by proxy in some of the sins of other people. Give approval. So we ought not to do that. But Peter is saying here in this verse, when a Christian does not run with them, but instead lives for the will and the glory of God, they speak evil about that person, him or her. It costs them. Godly priorities are condemning to the ones that don't possess them. The Christian, a lot of times, is misunderstood out in the world. And even silent non-participation becomes an offense to the world around you. They take offense at that. It implies a condemnation of their sin, the fact that you don't do that. You might not stand on a soapbox and preach against it. You might not condemn them directly. You might not confront them about what you view and know to be sin. The very fact that you're a silent non-participant causes them to be offended. They say the Christian, they say he refuses to be sociable. They say he thinks he's better than we are. I hate that about him. He thinks he's better than we are. And off goes the slander, and you get dragged through the mud. An upright lifestyle always testifies against a wicked one. And what is the standard weapon of the offended? They malign. They speak evil behind the back. They slander. So Peter is saying, don't go with them. Don't run with them. The time passed. It was sufficient for you to have, you've been saved out of all of that. Don't run with them in that. But if you don't run with that, be prepared for what's going to happen. You're going to pay for it. You're going to suffer for it. They'll be offended by it. Well, isn't it interesting, since Peter's day when he wrote this, how much has changed since then? Here we are over 2 millenniums removed from the day that Peter wrote that, and the world is so much a different place in so many ways, but this one thing right here has not changed. It's still the same. If you live differently against the crowd, you're going to pay for it. That's human nature. Human nature never changes, does it? But the power of the new birth is still the same as it was then. So he says, in regard to those that malign you, they will give an account. There's an audit. That's what this word is. It's an audit. There's a time of judgment coming. Someone's going to give an account. Time eventually does run out for all of us. It's appointed for man once to die, and then comes the judgment. We know that, and we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of God, give an account of himself to God. So here's this common phrase, the living and the dead. And all that means is it's all-inclusive. The judgment is all-inclusive. No one escapes it. Those who are alive when Christ comes will be judged, and those who are dead already will be judged as well. Jesus is the one appointed by God to judge the living and the dead. Peter said in Acts 10 to Cornelius, and Paul wrote in his second letter to Timothy, he gave that solemn charge there in the presence of Jesus Christ, who is to judge the living and the dead. So it's a common way of saying no one escapes, everyone. And so here are these people that are persecuting the Christian church, these believers that are trying to live a life that's separate from them, not a life of sin like the Gentiles are living for the will of God, and they're paying for it. Those people are going to stand before God, and it's not going to go well with them. God takes that personally, what happens to his people. One man that I read said this is how we're to understand it. Peter's telling his readers, wait patiently for the Lord. He will vindicate them when he should come to judgment and call those who had injured them to account for all the wrongs which they had done to his children. God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, and it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So they're going to suffer the judgment of God for doing wrong to his children who are trying to live their lives the right, doing the will of God. So there's an idea of vindication right here. And we see that in verse 6, which itself is a difficult verse in a lot of ways. The gospel has been, for this purpose, preached even to those who are dead. The Catholics say that's purgatory. The Catholics say the gospel is preached to those that are in purgatory and they're released to go on to glory. They're dead. They're in purgatory. There's another interpretation that runs along the lines of what we discussed, where Christ goes and preaches to the spirits that are now in prison, they say. All of that. They say this is more of that. Preaching to those that are in hell. But here's what I think is the true understanding. I think he's speaking about Christian martyrs right here. He's speaking about how the gospel was preached to those that are now dead. And the gospel was preached to them when they were alive. They believed the message. They were changed by it. The world was offended at them because they weren't running with the world into the same excesses. They were judged by councils and the opinions of men, and they suffered a martyr's death, a physical death, but now they live in the spiritual realm in heaven with God. I think that's how we understand that verse. The gospel for this purpose has been preached even to those who are now dead. They believed it. In the end, they were judged in the flesh as men, put to death, and they live in the Spirit according to the will of God. That's how I think we're to understand that right there. The decision, the verdict was leveled on their account, conclusions of men, the sentenced to die for their faith. They became martyrs. Death was only for a moment in the realm of the flesh, but life is forever in the Spirit. We live in the Spirit according to the will of God. So for you and I, we may not be martyrs. It's likely we won't be here. Martyrs. Some of our brethren in other lands, that's not true. They suffer to that extent. The suffering is so unique to everyone's different situation, is it not? And in some lands, these words are prophetic. They suffer martyrdom for their faith. But for all of us, we need to hear these words of admonition. Examine our hearts and commit to be done with sin and to live our lives not for the desires of the flesh. From this time forward, the time that remains in the flesh, to live it for the will of God, no matter what the cost. Resolve ourselves to do that. I think that's what Peter is saying to his readers here in this portion. If you do, it's going to cost you. You're going to suffer for the reasons that I explained. But resolve. Arm yourselves with the same purpose as Christ. Live for the will of God no matter the cost. I close with this one verse from 1 John 2:17. The world is passing away along with its desires, but the one who does the will of God abides forever. That's the way to leave this world and enter into judgment, having our sins paid for and resting on the atonement of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's the way to live for the will of God in this life and face whatever the cost might be. Well, amen. Once again, I say that's the best I can do with this. May the Lord help us.